Welcome to the Water People podcast. I'm Lauren Hill, and my co-host is Dave Rastovich. Today, we're in conversation with narrative nonfiction journalist and swimmer Susan Casey. Susan is the author of 3 New York Times best-selling books, including The Wave, In Pursuit of the Rogues, Freaks, and Giants of the Ocean. Susan was the creative director for Outside Magazine and served as editor-in-chief for both Sports Illustrated Women and the Oprah Magazine, as well as being editor-at-large across all of Time Inc.'s magazine titles. Our podcast comes to you from the coastal land and waters of both the Bundjalung and Gubbi Gubbi nations. We'd like to acknowledge these traditional custodians and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We'd also like to extend that respect to all First Nations people this podcast ripples out toward. I first encountered Susan Casey's work from her book, Voices in the Ocean, which...
No, that's not true. You would have encountered her work in Oprah Magazine many, many times. Nice try, but there's no way I was going to let you get away with hiding Oprah Winfrey's effect on your life.
We're mutual Oprah fans. I'd like to make that clear.
No. Yes, I have watched Oprah Winfrey shows while stuck in Florida inside the air conditioning while it's 40 degrees. That is true. I did cry. I grew up watching Oprah every day pretty much after my mom came home from work. And it was this powerful source of conversation and connection for my mom and I. Anyway, Susan Casey used to edit Oprah's magazine. Now she's a New York Times bestselling author of books, including the one that I was starting to mention, Voices in the Ocean, which is about, gosh, how do you put it succinctly? Dolphin culture. Yeah. Really. Yeah, well, the title is A Journey into the Wild and Haunting World of Dolphins. So it's a great book for all of us who have any interest at all in dolphin culture and human and dolphin interaction through time. Her other books, The Devil's Teeth, about great whites up in the Farallon Islands. Yeah, is it the Faroe Islands? They're the ones off California there. And then also the one that introduced me to her work was The Wave. And that is just amazing, amazing book about rogue waves and the nature of freak and giant waves in the ocean. And the thing that really got me so into her work was how she goes straight to the heart of the matter and first-hand experiential knowledge with these interests that she has and dives deeply. And our conversation with her revealed that, that years in the making, many, many years in the making of these books, 7 or so years for these books, and really just eats, sleeps and breathes these stories, which is
rooms
inspiring.
Full of research. We got to jump on Zoom with Susan, and in the background you could see these piles, these like looming piles of research that she's built up for the next project that she's working on. I was so excited to speak with her as an aspiring writer myself because, she is a master of her craft and is a beautiful storyteller. I love the way she has this ability to be firmly grounded in the factual, but also not hesitate from the imaginative or the spiritual or the mystical. She's really able to encapsulate and move between worlds in her writing, and I love that.
Yeah, definitely. And it feels like for those of us who are ocean-centric and have our connection to the ocean be through fishing, diving, sailing, snorkeling, surfing, swimming, whatever, paddling, we all know that there are moments in the water and around the water where we're intellectualizing the experience and we want to understand perhaps the science of why we feel so good when we're in and around the water. Or sometimes we can have totally indescribable mystic moments, and for us as surfers that's in the tube, or for you it'd be hanging 10 and levitating on the front of your nose of your longboard. And then there's the emotional element, and that's, I feel, why I've really loved her work, is that she does touch on all of those ways that we interpret and experience the ocean and everything there. So at a time where it feels like the way we communicate what we're passionate about is really important, you know, where we have such extremism and division, and we have algorithms that just reinforce our own perspective all the time. It feels like right now it's just so refreshing when we come across people who can tell stories in a way that loop us all in and perhaps touch different parts of our minds and bodies and spirits. And Susan's work does that. And of course, I feel like the dolphin world is a really tricky one to talk about and not be categorized as new agey and fluffy and whatever, you know, like just super touchy-feely. And she spoke about that and how, whoa, she's setting herself up here, going to somewhere like Dolphinville in Hawaii, where people have built a whole sort of community around swimming with dolphins and the epiphanies they have from those swims.
It's so interesting. And she goes there, like she literally goes there, but also she, in her storytelling, isn't afraid to delve into that territory, to also go into, you know, the most recent cetacean research, to talk about the history of cetacean research and this long-standing relationship going back to the ancient Minoan culture of Crete, to really look at this interspecies relationship across time and space and how we have changed and shaped each other.
Yeah, I've been on the receiving end of a lot of jokes when it comes to dolphin connections and stuff, and so I know what that feels like, but it just doesn't matter, because when you have an interaction like we often do at our closest beach here with the resident pod, actually the other day I had a surf where, or actually I had a whole day where we were just on the property and I slipped down through the bush and didn't see another human all day except for yourself and Minoa. And then I paddled out to the surf and had about 15 dolphins all around me, and we caught a wave together and actually had to bottom turn around them to not run into them as they were jumping out of the face of the wave. And I paddled back out and got another wave with them. And then I saw 2 humans down the end of the line of the wave. But in that day, I'd had 6 or 7 times more dolphins around me than humans in that whole day. And, you know, if I go any further and start talking about that experience and what it means to me, it starts to sound really cheesy and really on the nose. And so I don't, and I won't put you through that, listeners. But it is, that to me just shows how it takes a really very gifted storyteller to be able to navigate that space where you say something and an eye roll comes soon after.
Well, it's so much like surfing, or we've talked about this before, like sex. It just feels so much better than it sounds to talk about, to experience these things. But I feel so grateful to have access to someone like Susan Casey's work, because she can articulate these things in a way that feel a bit less eye-rolly and speak to these very real, true experiences that can be challenging to articulate.
Yeah. So for me, the opportunity to just get a little bit further into those stories, the things that couldn't fit into her books, and how she felt when she sat on a ski with Laird Hamilton and scooted down the face of a huge wave at Piahi.
Or went to the bottom of the deep ocean on a submersible.
Yep. Yeah, or going out with the biggest great whites out off the coast there in North America. And it's just great, you know, that she's someone who is just living on that vibrant edge and is able to report back to the rest of us what's happening out there in those places.
We always start the podcast with the question about a time or experience after which you were never the same. Do you have a story like that, Susan, that you'd be willing to share with us?
Of course. I mean, the problem is I have so many stories like that. I think honestly, I could give you 10. I mean, going down the face of Jaws with Laird Hamilton, when I'm not a big wave surfer, but I was writing about giant waves, he gave me the chance to fill one for myself. That certainly turned things upside down for me. It was able to understand something about the power of the ocean in a way that was more than intellectual. It's one thing to think about it or talk to scientists about it or watch it from a boat, and it's another thing to feel it reverberating, in your cells. But I have to say, the experience that changed everything for me was the Farallon Islands, my first book called The Devil's Teeth, because when I first went out there, I had not been exposed very much to the ocean. I should just say the Farallon Islands are 27 miles due west of the Golden Gate Bridge. They're actually technically part of San Francisco, but they are like on a different planet, really. And when you get out there, you realize just how wild things are. There's a lot of colliding currents. There's upwelling. There's just the whole food chain sort of swirling around there, and very large congregation of great white sharks. And the water is super dark, and you can't really see anything, but all these large animals come to the surface. The great white sharks come and eat seals on the surface. There are blue whales lunge feeding. And so I went out there to write about two scientists, and my exposure to the ocean hadn't been that extensive. I was a competitive swimmer, so I was a water person, but I grew up around lakes in Canada, and I had only done a couple ocean swims, and I was a little scared of it, actually. And it was that fear that kind of propelled me out there. And when I got there and I realized just how magnificent it was and how something could just pop up out of nowhere from this, basically what I could tell was like this parallel universe, all this action, all these animals, and we didn't know anything about it. And it's most of the planet. So that was like probably the most important thing for me, because I got bitten by the bug, and all I wanted to do was see what was in that parallel universe. And then slowly, after spending more time out there, I became more comfortable around the ocean and more in extreme conditions. And even though I'm never, as you know, like you can never really completely feel comfortable, you always have to have that sort of edge of knowing that you're in a power that's so much greater than you when you're out there. But it was more respect than fear. It was more like understanding than fear.
Wow. And so when you think back to that time, how long ago was that? And does it come back to you regularly where you think of that point where you were different after that time in the islands there?
Oh, I mean, when I first went out there, it was like 2001. It was, I was working in Manhattan. I was working for Time Inc., which was this big magazine publisher that published Time Magazine and a bunch of other magazines. And they allowed me to go out there this is back in the day when magazines had all this money. They allowed me to go out there and just to check it out, to maybe write a story about it. And it was very hard to get a permit, but I got out there for like 5 hours. And of course, I didn't see a shark that day, but I did see a decapitated seal carcass and met the scientists. And that began a sort of ongoing relationship where I would go back out there every year, and sometimes legally, sometimes illegally, just to participate in a science program and write about it. And yeah, it never goes away. In fact, I'm working on a book right now where I'm sort of circling back to that initial notion that, that we think about the ocean as being the part that we see, but that's just the skin. That's the ceiling of the room. I mean, the whole room that's below it, which is like 93% of the planet is below 600 feet. 93% of the living space by volume is what I mean. Like, it's just all of the planet. Life exists in the darkness. So I'm thinking a lot about that right now. And that was the place where I really was first given the opportunity to experience it. Yeah. It really haunts my dreams, that place. It is not a place where humans are in charge. And that's sort of refreshing, it's, there are so many things that are bigger than we are, especially when you're dealing with the ocean. And I think it would do our species quite a bit of good to take a little bit of that humility on board on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's so wonderful, isn't it, that the ocean does that for us in a way, or to us, where it's not our imagining or visualizing our insignificance in the grand scheme of things. It's not a visualization or a meditation. It's actually happening in real time when, like you said, when you're on that face of that wave at Jaws, or you're looking at those incredible apex predators out in the Farallon Islands. It's just happening right there, and it's obvious that you feel it in your bones how weak of a swimmer we are when you're around a big fish like that. You feel how little you are when you see that amazing green cathedral, blue cathedral. That's how I've always termed Piahi. It's like every 20 seconds a new Sistine Chapel is being built, illuminated by the sun, and then deconstructed, and then another one comes and you can't help but stare at it in absolute awe. And it's so wonderful that someone like yourself, who can write so beautifully and articulately, has gone to those experiences and those places, and that's just, it's so wonderful, because I feel like you have been able to gift a lot of people that feeling of what it feels like to be there in those spaces. Yeah, which is why we're so stoked to be able to chat with you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that's, what a beautiful way to put it. I mean, Piahi is sublime. I really like this concept, particularly when you're dealing with something like a 60-foot wave. The sublime being the spectacular beauty, but there's an edge of something bigger than beauty. It verges into the idea of, somebody said, it's like it fills your mind with the most agreeable horror. But it's like if you look at a giant mountain, or if you look at a giant wave, or if you think about journeying down into the abyss, or these are things that there's just a certain, I guess, awe-provoking quality to them. And so that's why I think the sublime is a word that comes up a lot for me. And I think I like it. I think that's what I seek.
That sounds like the path for a life well lived, constantly seeking the sublime. You mentioned The Devil's Teeth, Susan, and to close out that book is just the most beautiful line that resonates with me all the time. And you wrote, "There's another world, and it's in this one." You mentioned you didn't grow up around saltwater, you grew up around freshwater, but you've come to write this series of books dealing with the ocean, and like Dave was saying, taking us all on these incredible, awe-inspired adventures into this parallel world. But how did you come to make a life and a livelihood that really revolves around the ocean? I mean, what has kept you coming back book after book to keep diving into our watery world?
After my last book, Voices in the Ocean, about dolphins, I actually had a book idea that was had a bigger environmental bent to it than the ocean. It was more about extreme risks that we're taking with our own survival. And I spoke to my editor about it and asked, hey, what do you think if I was to write a book? I wasn't setting out to try to write a book that wasn't about the ocean. He said, yeah, sure, go ahead. But after I worked on the proposal for a while, it was more like almost 2 years I worked on it, I realized that I wasn't having that much fun. And things were not going that well with just various, it's like the universe was kind of trying to take me off that path. And I eventually finished it, showed it to my editor, and he said, well, I really like this, but there's going to be a lot of other books writing about this. You could do it, but I don't know if it's the best thing for you to do. And I just went, okay, I'm not doing it. And I went back to what I had been hoping to write about before that idea came along, and which was the deep ocean, everything below 600 feet. And almost the moment I started to work on that, everything just everything went easier. I was happier. I had more fun. And I just think if writing is a way of sort of taking people into this a world, and I think hopefully it's a world that readers want to hang out in with you, it helps if you love it so much. I mean, there's just nothing to me that even remotely rivals the fascination of the ocean. And there's never going to be any shortage of stories to tell about it. So, I think it just was one thing led to another. It's my friend, a friend of mine, Martha Beck, says you should always, in your own compass, you have a true north. And that's mine. When I try to go off it, I end up in places that I'd rather not be. So probably part intuition, part stubbornness.
I'm really interested in your style of immersive journalism. You write yourself into your stories. You're not afraid to use the pronoun I. And I really wanted to ask you about how you grapple or handle the idea of objectivity, and if it's of importance to you in the course of writing stories that interweave science and anecdotal experiences.
I mean, I'm a journalist, but I don't, not a newspaper reporter, and I write it kind of in a style that's called many names. I mean, the one I like is narrative nonfiction. It is also called the new journalism sometimes. And I mean, I don't think it's possible to be objective, completely objective. But on the other hand, I don't want to start some project where I'm in the tank for somebody. I kind of aim for neutral. I start off, I'm not a skeptic. I'm not a foaming at the mouth fan of somebody I'm writing about. But in general, I try to write about people who I think are doing really cool things, just because I don't want to spend my time or my creative energy, trying to take somebody down. I did have a villain in Voices in the Ocean. It was a dolphin trader. He exported and caught, and it was an uncomfortable process. And I wouldn't say I would never write about people that I don't like, but I really like writing about people who I admire. And I admire scientists. And even though I'm not a scientist, will just sort of take the time and find the right scientists and talk. The ones that I tend to hang out with are the ones that don't mind if I ask them a really unreasonable amount of questions. I'll say things like, could you please explain this the way you would explain this to a third grade class? And I try to span the whole range between reading the actual scientific literature and trying to get them to do it for me as sock puppets so I can really understand it. Because there's nothing more fascinating in a lot of ways than what's going on in the science world, but not every scientist not the brilliant brain that does the science is not always the same kind of person who's going to be able to talk about it in an engaging way. So in that regard, I guess I'm kind of a bridge. So I guess that's my version of objectivity. But I also think that if anybody's going to sit down at this particular moment in our culture and spend, I don't know, hours and days maybe reading a book, there's got to be some sort of emotional payoff for them. And just dumping a bunch of information on people does not engage their emotions. And this is an issue, I think, that comes up a lot when you start to feel like an activist, which at this point, I'm clearly an activist, but I won't get where I want to get in my narrative part of my job, my storytelling part of my job, by letting the activist part of my head take over. I will slide that into the narrative as opposed to just laying it out on the table. Like, this is bad, this is good, So there's a certain sort of balance to it, I guess you'd say, between subjectivity and complete, I'm looking for another word than activism, but something beyond subjectivity, and then just information. The information can be used in service of the narrative as long as it's accurate. I mean, they take a lot of care to make sure that everything that I write that has a science underpinning, and actually everything that I write totally is accurate. I record everything. I transcribe all my own recordings. I make a real point of ensuring accuracy, because to simplify something, it doesn't have to be to diminish it, but it can be if you don't fully understand what it is that what all the ingredients are in the consomme, I guess. You boil it down, but hopefully at the end it's something richer as opposed to something that's just smaller. You know what I mean?
Mm. Yeah, definitely. Is that a process or an approach that you have cultivated while you've been writing, while you've been doing your books, or is that something that was really imparted to you at an earlier time in your life by anyone in particular or any mentors?
Well, yes and yes, I think, because when I was out of the Farallon Islands, I sort of ended up with this great big story that wasn't a magazine article at all. It was a book. I figured that out. But at that particular moment in time, I was a magazine editor, and I had done some writing, but not a lot, and certainly never written anything long, except for the book proposal. That was the longest thing I'd ever written. And one of my friends who now works with John Oliver, Tim Carvel, who had edited a column that I wrote, said, there's only one thing you need to remember, and that's take notes all the time. If you have something incredible happens to you and it's in the middle of the night and you're like, okay, I'll remember that 3 hours from now after I sleep, you won't. So you always have to sit down and keep notes, and there's just no such thing as too many notes. That was the best advice I ever got. But I think as I've continued to figure out how to work, I've refined my own system, which almost everybody I know who writes has got a system of their own. Some people use a lot of index cards. Everybody's got their own little thing that they've figured out works for them to sort of juggle all this material. And it keeps evolving, obviously. I keep trying to refine it. It will never be perfect.
Susan, one of the things I wanted to ask you, which it's a question, but it answers itself in a way with the opening quote in Voices in the Ocean about magic, that magic exists. Or what is it? Is the world is full of magic things waiting for our senses to grow sharper. You've really dove deep into specific subjects, and for us it's Voices in the Ocean and The Wave, and I think I've probably read The Wave 4 or 5 times and passed it on to pretty much everyone I know who surfs. And I wanted to know your deep inquiries into these areas. It's developed even more of a sense of awe and wonder for you. Is it that way? Do you feel like engaging your intellectual curiosity to match your stirred emotions on an issue, does it all lead to a more amazing world for you? Like when you finish a project, you look back and go, wow, I have so much more awe and appreciation than I did before I started the process of writing a book.
Yeah, because I think there's so many dimensions to the ocean. I mean, there's the biological dimension. There's the interplay between the wind and the surface, the wave dimension of it. There's the deep. And right now, working through the layers of the deep and having actually now had the chance to go into the abyss myself a couple times, it is beyond anything. I actually really spend a lot of time thinking, like, how can you possibly translate some of this stuff into words? This book is going to take me 8 years by the time I'm done. And I think it's because it's big. This whole, as a human on planet Earth, the vastness and the magnificence and there's a different temporal quality to it. I mean, we're from it. We're a part of it, but it doesn't have much to do with us in terms of it. It's just the great gears of the planet, the processes that take billions of years, the creation of life, coming up through the surface of the seabed, but the seabed itself even goes down miles beneath that. It's filled with life. And so the science keeps emerging about what they call the deep biosphere, which is even way beneath the surface of this, the ocean crust. And the more we look and the more we learn about life in the ocean, I mean, the top of your head can blow off. It's just the kingdom of majesty. And so, yeah, it does. The awe does build up. I have to say, when I got out of my first submersible dive, as we got closer to the surface, the emotion that I started feeling was grief. And it was like a very deep grief that I've only ever felt once in my life when I lost my father. And I just did not want to get out of that submersible. I felt like I was being ripped out of my home. And I knew that I wasn't probably going to have another chance, at least not anytime soon, to do it again. And it just, I couldn't talk because if I talked, I was going to sob. Have you ever had a chance to dive in a submersible? It is just spiritual beyond belief.
So can you tell us a little bit more?
Can you talk us through the firsthand experience of you went in Alvin, right? Who's been in operation for 50 years or something?
No, but I was in James Cameron's submersible. It's called Neptune, and it's got a plexiglass hull. This one dove to 1,000 meters, so it was like 3,300 feet. And when they're not diving any deeper than that, actually they can dive a little bit deeper than that with the plexiglass hull, but that's still what they call the twilight zone. That's the zone right underneath the epipelagic zone, the sunlight zone of the ocean. So it goes from about 600 feet down to, 200 meters down to 1,000 meters, basically. But it is one of the most liveliest layers of the ocean. It's got just a tremendous amount of life. So the dive that I was mentioning was that one. And then the second dive that I did was in Victor Vescovo's submersible, which is a full ocean depth submersible. It's the only one of its kind that's ever existed. It's the only one of its kind that exists now. It's privately owned, and and it goes to 11,000 meters.
Wow.
I just had the opportunity to dive in that one as well. But that's a different experience. That's like being in the space shuttle or something. The one that really got me emotionally was the dive into the twilight zone. Because when we got down there, first of all, you're in this plexiglass bubble, so you can see everything. It's like you put out your hand, you're not even really sure where the water is. It's made by a company called Triton, who I think are just geniuses. They're like the Apple of submersible design. And when we got into the midwater, like where it was completely dark, the pilot covered up all the lights and turned off every light and told us to shut our eyes. And then he counted to 3. And on the count of 2, he flashed the lights of the sub. And on the count of 3, we opened our eyes and all the gelatinous creatures flashed us back. And we just did that over and over again. It was like this communication. It was like this correspondence in a language of light and frequency that we don't know how to speak a word of. And it's the lingua franca of life on Earth when you think of how big that region is compared to, the land that we live on. These creatures, they speak in light. Most of the creatures in the deep are bioluminescent or have that capability or have some biofluorescence or some. It's just like a really lively scene down there, and far more than just this dark emptiness. I mean, there's nothing empty about it. It is filled. It's a soup of life. And you see this marine snow, then you think parts of it are detritus from the surface, like bits of things and dust and all that. But a lot of them are tiny little creatures. Most of it is tiny little creatures. And you see these fish that they always show. They're like the emissaries of the deep ocean. They're supposed to scare you with the giant teeth and the weird faces. They're like the size of a quarter. They're these adorable little things. They're so cute.
Wow. So yeah. when you're moving back up through all of that life and you're coming towards the surface, why grief? Why was that the feeling you had?
Well, that blue color that you get, you see it at Piahi, you see it in Hawaii, I'm sure you see it in Australia, where the light is coming through. And to me, that color, it's not even a color. It's like an emotion. It's an experience that you feel on this very deep level. For me, it is like a resonance. Like that is the color that, for me, that's the color of home. And I didn't want to leave it. We were 200 feet still under the surface and things were getting lighter and I just didn't want to go up. And I felt like it would be like if you were allowed to visit somebody that you loved for 6 hours and then you were never going to see them again. That's what it felt like.
That's really interesting. To me, the first thing that comes to my mind when you speak of that is that feeling when you free dive, because there is that experience also where you're in the deep and your body's chemistry is changing and you're being pulled down once you go past that negative buoyancy level, and there is like a returning feeling. And I guess they summed it up amazingly in that movie, The Big Blue, where he just swims off into the deep blue with the dolphins. But it's fascinating to me that you can still have that experience inside a submersible as well. And there's something almost embryonic or something there, that feeling of being completely held and wrapped. And I know in surfing, the core of the joy in the surfing experience is tube riding, and that's very much the same thing. When you're totally encapsulated in spinning blue water or whatever color it is, but there's light coming through there, and you just want to stay there. It's like a few seconds of clock time, but it is so significant that we build our whole lives around it.
And time gets very strange in those spaces. Like when we were down there for about 7 hours. You could have told me it was 30 minutes and I would have believed you. And
I didn't think it would be that long.
Says that.
What's the space of the submersible like? Can you stand up fully erect? And is there a toilet?
No. No. I mean, you're in this one had 3 people in it. So it was a little bigger than, it was maybe a 7-foot diameter plexiglass sphere. I mean, everybody has a comfortable seat, but you're not moving around. Although I did at one point change places with the pilot and get to drive it for a bit on the bottom. But that one was spacey. The other one I went in was very tight, like being in a phone booth almost. It was 5 meters sphere, and you're just covered in oxygen bottles. And, I actually did not have to pee. I was worried about that. And somebody told me the trick to that is that you take a really warm shower like 30 minutes before you go. And apparently that tricks your body for like 10 hours.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's great to know. I don't think we'll be flying anytime soon, but if we do, that's what I'll do.
What you said about the communication with light from these creatures is just so beautiful. And Dave, it reminds me of when we were camping a couple of months ago, and we had an experience. A friend caught a squid, and the squid seemed like it was dead. It was no longer living, but it was flashing these patterns, these beautiful shifting light mosaics. And it was kind of a revelation for me, similar to what you're saying, just going, this creature is capable of communicating in a way that I have no capacity to understand. I have no way to translate or decode what this creature is saying. And then in that moment, I was going, who am I to eat this intelligence? Which is a totally different conversation, but that's what it brought up for me. It was a really astounding moment of remembering how small we are, how narrow our sensory systems are, how narrow our capacity for communication is compared to the myriad other ways of understanding and being in the world there are, and through the varying intelligences of other beings on this planet. That was a major moment for me.
Is that something you're going to really grapple with when writing this new book, trying to interpret what you were feeling and experiencing with that language of light down there and wrap those feelings, those experiences into the tiny vessels of words?
Oh, yeah. But that is the challenge right there. It's so beyond words. So whatever I do won't be able to do it justice. I'll just do my best. But it's the same. It was the same with Voices in the Ocean. It's like, this, I know you know this. You're in that book, by the way. You're mentioned in that book.
Yeah, very honored. I was I
should have actually spoken to you in person about that, but now maybe I'll have a chance now. But the intelligences, the minds in the water, I mean, that is enough to humble you right there. I mean, they've had their big brains for, I'm going to maybe get this number wrong, but 200 million years. Would have to look that up to get it exact, but it's a long time. And we have had our big brains for, somewhere between 800,000 and 200,000 years. So like John Lilly said, we're babies in the universe, and imagine a world where your vision as a primary sense is not a very good survival strategy, because it's, even if you're near the surface, it's dark half the time. And if you're in the depths, it's dark all of the time. So they're the masters of acoustic interpretation and frequency and patterns of energy. And so us as a species, I think if we were to survive ourselves and evolve, hopefully, in a better direction, it would be that we could understand that just because we don't see something with our eyes doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's somehow diminished. There's this frequency that comes from the vibe that people give off. And it's not just about what feeds into your eyes and gets churned around in your brain and then gets kind of filtered through some cultural set of preconceptions and stories and things like that. Like, there is just this pure set of energies that the rest of nature uses to interact with. And I hope we can get there, I hope we can get there. And you think about the subtleties of say, cetacean communication. I mean, it's awesome. It's incredible.
You mentioned Dr. John Lilly. I'd love for you to speak to his story a little bit more for people who maybe haven't read Voices in the Ocean yet. Can you talk us through his wild experiments?
Well, so John Lilly was straight from the medical establishment, from the military, highly credentialed, was a neuroscientist and also worked with the military. So he, gray suited 50s, buttoned up, military, started getting a look at cetacean brains. And this is in the Cold War era. There was a sense of, well, what if we could make people do what we wanted? And, there was a lot of funding for experimenting on the brain. And he got a pilot whale brain and he saw some other cetacean brains and it just blew his mind. I mean, he started to do experiments with dolphins and he had encounters with dolphins that he couldn't explain. His rigorous empirical science training went a little bit out the window when he started to do things like he invented the isolation tank so he could put himself into an environment where he would be, in his thoughts, a mind floating in the water to try to understand what it would be like to be a dolphin. And he ended up going over to the Virgin Islands, getting his own island, and he had a kind of a Dr. No set up there with a lot of very beautiful female assistants walking around and bottlenose dolphins and buildings. And one of them was a house that was half filled with water and half not. And his notion was that could humans and dolphins live together? And that experiment went horribly wrong and kind of got him excommunicated from the science world. But he never gave up. I mean, he continually wanted to try to figure out some sort of a breakthrough where humans could communicate with dolphins. And along the way, he just took a huge amount of LSD. And but he was in he ended his life on Maui, where I lived until recently. And people said, he ended his life sort of staring out to sea. He was contemplating the mysteries right up until his last breath. And his writing is fantastic. I mean, but it is amazing to me that he thought that it hurt his feelings that science kind of kicked him out. But he was so far away from, at that point, the dolphins had led him in a completely different direction. And he was a wise man, but he just maybe even a little ahead of his time. I don't know. What do you guys think of him?
I was going to ask you why perhaps maybe he did go down this route of inquiry, but I haven't seen any information about him doing this, but why he perhaps didn't go to indigenous cultures that still have strong links with cetaceans in this point in time and have obvious communication that goes back and forth between them. Have you come across any of his writing or any efforts of his to go down that route at all?
No, I've read a lot of his stuff. And I think that when he started getting into his LSD era and his ketamine era, he was just sort of in the ether. But his whole upbringing, his acculturation and all that, he came from a world that wouldn't have had the foresight to do that. They wouldn't have had the understanding of why that would be an important thing to do. As I said, straight from the military, straight from I don't forget which college it was, like Princeton or Yale or something, but like straight from the Cold War era US. And he went a long way. I mean, he went a long way as I think he's almost more known for as a counterculture hero now than he is as a scientist, which I think is appropriate. I mean, his science didn't only went so far. He killed a lot of dolphins experimenting on them. But he, for example, was the guy who figured out that they're not autonomic breathers. They're conscious breathers. If you put them under anesthesia, they'll die. They don't just keep breathing. And to think of something that simple that wasn't even known in, say, 1960, it's pretty amazing. I mean, people would call them fish and, didn't really understand them.
There's some really fascinating stories that I've heard mostly from Polynesian circles, so from New Zealand all the way across to Hawaii, of interactions and relationships with cetaceans are just fascinating. And one book called Dolphin by Wade Doak, I don't know if you ever came across this book, But it's a bunch of Kiwis in the 70s and 80s in New Zealand who were having very frequent swims and time spent in the water with resident bottlenose dolphins on the North Island. And they developed this term called interlock, where you would basically get to a state of sort of communicative connection between a dolphin and a human. And so they were, part of what they were doing was trying to crack the code, trying to figure out how is it we can somehow understand each other. And so what they were doing was these sort of exercises in deep visualization, where they discovered that if they placed themselves in their mind in the body of the dolphin and just visualized how the humans looked from the dolphin's point of view, and then perhaps visualize doing a type of motion as the dolphin, so putting a piece of seaweed on the right pectoral fin and coming up to the surface to the humans and doing that action. If the humans visualized that action, but from the dolphin's perspective, they got to a reliable point where the dolphin would come up and do that action. And then they would visualize another interaction of some sort, but always from the dolphin's perspective. And that was a way that they feel they cracked the code of at least being able to interact with each other in a way where they were having these, very simple interactions, but there were really clear results from it. And so anyway, that I've always found that really fascinating, and mention it to anyone who is open to speaking about such things, because it's fun and it's just an interesting curiosity, but it is still a code that we perhaps haven't cracked as Westerners, as modern folk here. But I was just curious to see if you had any more insights or anything that perhaps didn't make the book that were along those lines. Oh, yeah?
I mean, I spent a lot of time with this one group on the Big Island that were pretty into that whole notion. Their sort of leader is a woman named Joan Ocean. And Joan used to work with John Lilly. And she just is this really very new agey person and very lovely, and spent just sort of changed her life to swim with dolphins. So she moved to the Big Island and started swimming every single day in this one bay, Kealakekua Bay, and felt that the dolphins were downloading information to her all the time. And I wrote about it pretty extensively in Voices in the Ocean. Some science people were really pissed off that I did that, but to me, it's equally interesting. It's like approaching from the other side of your brain. And she would get messages from them that would just download. And it wasn't something as obvious as a sound, like them making a sound at them. Although they do make sounds when they do various things, like if they clap their jaws, they're pissed off, or, but that is not how we interact with animals. They're not going to open their mouths one day and start speaking English to us, or we're going to figure out how to make a dolphin sound. And it is some sort of mind meld. It is this sort of like understanding on an energetic level of two beings. Like if you have a dog or a cat, you've experienced this. And we can do this with every bit of nature, but it is not a muscle that we work very often. Learning about the neurochemistry and the neuroanatomy of our brains versus a dolphin brain was really a revelation for me, because their brains are just set up, wired a little differently. They have more gray matter in an area of the limbic system that really relates to emotion. It relates to empathy. It relates to more of a collective idea. And maybe this isn't a brain adaptation that we'll eventually get to if we survive as a species as long as they have. And they've been through so many iterations. I mean, they were on land, then they were not social creatures when they first got into the water. Then they became social creatures with high frequency hearing. Like they've adapted. And you can really make a strong argument that they are the most adapted creatures on this planet to live on an aquatic planet in a very collective way. So there is not this sense, when you look at how their brains are constructed, there is just not the sense of every dolphin for himself. It doesn't compute. Like the most intriguing concept that I came across during the research of that book, which, one of the characters in it is probably the world's most eminent cetacean neuroscientist, this woman, Lori Marino, who really had the chops from the traditional, the university, the peer-reviewed papers, everything. And eventually realized, once she proved that dolphins could recognize themselves in a mirror, became unable to do experimentation on any sort of captive dolphin, and started becoming a more of a voice for trying to, express the moral obligations that we have to take care of other creatures that are sentient and just as intelligent as we are, in a different manner. So this notion that blew my mind was that the very sense of self, like once a dolphin can recognize themselves in a mirror, that may seem like a simple thing to do, but it's this huge cognitive leap to say that that's me. Like the concept of self is kind of a big deal. Not every animal has done that mirror test and acted like they recognized that they were looking at a self. But dolphins have, some of the great apes have, magpies have, elephants have.
Some cephalopods? I think some cephalopods as well.
I don't know about it. I haven't heard of that experiment yet. And they're certainly smart enough, but whether or not their brain is wired in that way, because this whole sense of self that we take for granted, to dolphins, it might be something different. Instead of the self ending, like I am me and you are you, there might be a self that's more like, I kind of, after reading about it, described it as a level beyond empathy, where not only do I care about you, but on a certain level, I am you. So that makes a lot of sense when you start thinking about some of the things we can't explain about dolphins, like why, for example, in Taiji, why don't they jump out? They can't dissociate in that same way. Like like I said, there's no such thing as every dolphin for himself, And it's an intriguing question. You can never prove that hypothesis, but I do think that like I said, if our brains were to evolve in that direction, we somehow cared about each other's well-being more, we would be moving in the right direction.
I feel like the sort of popular storytelling these days around sort of discoveries like that is definitely happening when we see things like, the mycelial networks and the secret life of trees, the hidden life of trees, all those books and stories that are gaining such a loving audience these days. It is perhaps a sign that we are heading in that direction, or that we have that appreciation of gaining a real sensitivity towards the oneness of all of this. And I don't know, I feel like it's exciting to hear you talk about that, and to speak of examples of where that's happening already all around us in various ways.
That moment that you're talking about in the barrel, or the moment that I'm talking about in the submersible, the thing that those also have in common is that there are these moments of stillness where, not just stillness, but where you're fully present. And those are that moment, that instant when you're fully present, that is where all the magic happens. That's where all the communication happens, and where all the awareness happens. And so, like, I think that's why you do build your lives around this, because what else is there? This is a way to get there. And I think it's all about getting there. Or not getting there, being there.
Is your primary outlet for being there still swimming?
Yeah. Swimming is, like, for me, is a meditation.
You mentioned that you were living in Maui until recently. Where are you going to base now, and will you still have access to a body of water to swim?
Well, I'm going to spend half my time in Hawaii and half my time here, and just became a little difficult logistically being that far away from everything. And yet, I never really want to be away from the ocean for too long. There are amazing lakes here. Yeah, I will always find a place to swim. I'm great with pools too. I just like any body of water where I can swim. But the ocean, of course, is my favorite.
Apologies for interrupting the conversation, but we'd like to take a moment to recognize the generous folks who help make this podcast possible.
Thanks to Gary McNeil Concepts, who put together cosmic boards for cosmic people. Gaz's boards combine recycled and plant-based materials that are built to last without sacrificing performance. To learn more, head to GaryMcNeilConcepts.com.
Susan, I couldn't have the privilege of speaking with you without bringing up your research about the great Minoan civilization. When I was pregnant and we were trying to think up names for our little boy, I think I'd recently read your book and I thought about just some of the beautiful values that you were able to glean from your research about Minoan culture. And instantly, Dave and I had encountered research about them over the years, and then we just knew, we were like, oh my gosh, that's the name of our son. He's going to be Minoa.
I love that. I love that. I mean, to even find people who know anything about the Minoans is like a real rarity. And they really are, I mean, I'm tempted to write a book about the Minoans because it makes me so happy to learn about them. The funny thing is, how I found them was I set out to find the oldest art that I could find that had been like where somebody sat down and did a painting or made a bowl or did something like to try to indicate that there was a relationship with dolphins. And that research led me to them. And then I'm reading about it and I'm like, wait a minute, they were taken out by a giant tsunami, a giant wave. And I just spent 5 years and writing about this. Like, how did I not hear about this? Why don't I know about this? And the more I learned about them, the more I just sort of fell in love with them. And I mean, they were a whole different ball game. They had a civilization that had different rules, and it seemed to be really working for them. And how they ended was a big mystery. But this is a very long conversation if you want to have it. But it's just what they did leave behind are thousands and thousands and thousands of really well-preserved artworks, which are very detailed, and a spiral-shaped artifact that has their writing on it that's got little pictograms of various things in nature that nobody can decipher, no linguist can tell. This is the language called Linear A. I mean, they were magnificent. And if you look at their paintings, they had beautiful cities, they had beautiful clothing, they loved beauty. They had a lot of fun. They had no money. And by no money, I don't mean they were poor. They had literally no currency. They didn't use it. In all of the artworks, there is no imagery. They traded. They were artists, and they were among the best artists. A lot of their stuff ended up in Egypt, where the pharaohs, of course, could buy anything they wanted. The Minoans just wanted to do sports and revel in nature and make everybody happy, basically. They were a prosperous society. When you go over there and you see the buildings that have been excavated, like they were living large they had everything. But they didn't choose to do it the way we did it, where there was no hierarchical thing going on. There was no, in all the thousands and thousands and thousands of images that they've left, their paintings, their artworks, there is not one single image of violence. There's none of the classical Greek stuff of women being carried off by their hair or animals being run through with a sword. There's like nothing going on like that there with the Minoans. You really get the sense that when I was over there, I had an archaeologist show me around, and it was during the time of Greek austerity. And so the excavation of Thera, which is on Santorini, was called Akrotiri. This city, I think of it as like a Sydney or a San Francisco of the Minoan world. They've started to excavate it, and it's very well preserved, but it's going to take a lot of money. So they've only done a small portion of it. But among some of the things they got, when all the volcanic ash buried it, they were able to pull these frescoes. Then they had they're like 10 feet by 10 feet. And so I was allowed to go see some of the ones that had never been exhibited, but I wasn't allowed to take any pictures of them. And when they pulled it out it was like a wall on rollers. They pulled it out, and it had all the little fragments. They were piecing it together. And it was all I could do just not to fall over onto my knees. It was so beautiful. And what it was a picture of this beautiful woman in profile. And she was sitting in a chair. She had this long, black, beautiful braid that had like dragonflies instead of like dragon. And then she had a necklace of dragonflies around her neck and this beautiful gown. And just like on either side of her were two griffins, but they weren't like the terrible, scary, they were like these beautiful birds with lions' bodies. And then there was a young girl who giving her a flower, and behind her there was a blue monkey, And it was just like that it was Mother Nature, and they called her Potnia. And it was just all about nature. And that's why their symbol is the spiral, because nature works that way. When we tend to think of life as, this beginning, middle, end, straight line sort of thing. But to the Minoans, life was a spiral. It was all about the spiral.
Mm-hmm. Can you situate the Minoan culture in time for us? Like, we're talking about an ancient civilization.
Yeah, we're talking, they disappeared around 1500 BC. The era in which some of their most famous artworks occurred was like 1700 BC. And they were around long before that. And they were in the Cyclades, Islands in Greece, Crete, and Thera, which is what Santorini was known as, and maybe some of the others as well. And they had what they call the palatial area, where they built these large compounds that are often referred to as palaces, but there wasn't a king or a queen. I mean, there may have been this whole stuff about King Minos and all that. I think that's just nonsense. There was no king of the Minoans. If anything, it was a matriarchal society, but I don't even think it was really that. I think it was a real joint venture between the sexes, and that there was just a lot of respect for the femininity, because that was the power of creation. There's this great book that I found as I was researching called, unfortunately the author has passed away, but it's called In Search of the Lost Feminine. I think I told you about it. That book goes into great detail about why they were different in this way. This sort of, I don't know, the lost feminine is loss of connection with nature. Mm-hmm. And that's where we find ourselves now. And we got to get back from that, because that's a story that doesn't end well. So so when the Minoans disappeared, I mean, they were the first ocean going, they call them the thalassocracy, and there's another guy who wrote a book. Gosh, I forget the name of it. The author's name is Gavin Menzies, though. And he was a naval officer, and he went over and saw some of the frescoes and looked at the boats and went, wait a minute, that's a hydrofoil. Mm. That boat has a hydrofoil. And just sort of realized that their abilities in the ocean and their understanding of the ocean was much more advanced. And who knows, Oceania, Polynesia, all of these cultures, these sort of ancient cultures had a big relationship with the ocean, and I would love to know more about all of it. It seems to a lot of it has been lost, and people talk about, well, Aristotle was the first marine biologist. It's like, I don't think so.
And Susan, is it true that no human remains have been found from Minoan civilization?
They have found Minoan remains from long ago, but what they don't have, which this is mind-blowing, is when this Akrotiri, this city in Thera, in Santorini, when it was covered in ash, when basically Santorini cracked and the volcano blew its top, and the caldera that you see that's on all the postcards is incredibly deep. And that was a round mountain. That was the peak of a mountain that was in there. So this whole place was smothered under ash. So this whole city was smothered under ash. And there was obviously quite a lot of earthquake action before it. And maybe they were able to get away. But when the archaeologists began to excavate Akrotiri, there are no bones there. There are no animal bones. There's not a single human skeleton. Imagine if they tried to evacuate any city that we know of on planet Earth today. Can you imagine? There's no way there wouldn't be. I don't understand. I mean, It was, if I could time travel, that's where I would go. I would want to see what was going on that day, because it's a mystery. And so people think, okay, they were able to get away. They got in boats, they left. But how do you do that? How do you get every last person? How does every elder get out? I mean, how does every dog get out? I don't know.
I love, Susan, that, like you just said, if you could time travel, that's where and when you would go. But with what you have got, you use and you go to these places. And that's something I really love about your writing, is that you didn't just read about and speak to others about Minoan history. You went there and you felt the place. You smelt the air. You felt the sun on your skin in that area. And I feel like it would be lovely to hear from you about your reason for doing that when you are in a project or a real state of inquiry about something. I love that you just go straight to the source of what it is you're researching and writing about. Why do you do that?
I think for nonfiction writing, everybody has to do that, short of like if you're writing about an event that occurred. I mean, I'm trying to think of anybody I know who wouldn't do this in my field, but I do agree with you that I've gone to some great lengths to try to get into some of these places.
Not everyone's on the back of a ski. Not everyone who writes would go, I'm going to get on a ski with Laird and go out to Piahi, or sit in the channel at Chopu and have that wave explode all over you. It's, you go to the depths, and you're doing that now again. Yeah, it's just, I'd love to hear more about it.
That's the joy of it too, is like being able to tell people like, hey, look over it. Like, look at this thing. I mean, it is, maybe readers won't all get to go to the Farallon Islands, although you can get on a whale watching boat and go around it. But let's go places and do stuff. I always think of myself as like a proxy for the curious person. Like I will go out there and try to do this. If you're interested in doing it and don't have the time, can't do it for whatever reason, come along with me. I'll do it with you. To me, that's fun. And that is also the sort of, I guess, full immersion that I like to write about. I think it's easier to write about something if you actually have smelled it and touched it and seen it, and it gives you a better shot at creating an immersive experience for the reader too, I think. Yeah.
Do you have work now where you are able to, it's a strange period in time for gathering and holding events or doing book tours or speaking events. Is that something that's been a part of your life, and perhaps you're adapting with it right now, of being with others and storytelling, person to person, speaking engagements, that kind of thing?
I mean, I always enjoy going out and talking to people. I feel like my books are a bit of a dog whistle, and the people that read them and want to talk to me, I really want to talk to them too. And to meet kindred spirits all over the world is the great joy of my life. I right now I'm kind of fortunate because I had done most of my reporting, and the time that has overlapped with COVID has coincided with me planning anyway to be in the real inner space of writing. So aside from a few reporting trips that I had to postpone, I've just been here the way I would have been even without this pandemic. So I'm very grateful for that. Although I wouldn't say I'm firing on completely all cylinders. I think like everybody, it was a weird year. So I think this book won't be done till 2023 now. I was hoping it would be late fall 2022. But it's on track, so I'm fortunate.
I love what you wrote about the other day on your Instagram account. Just simply, you said Mars schmars. I just want to keep going to the bottom of the ocean. We're in a time where there's, I don't know if we've sort of passed peak Mars obsession, fascination or not, but a lot of people are set on exploring other worlds.
Count on
it. What makes you set your fascination and your mind and your inquiry on this planet rather than setting your eyes to the extraterrestrial?
Look, I would love to go into space. I mean, who wouldn't? I think that would be fantastic. But there's this problem that we have right now with constant defining progress as constant expansion. Like we need more of this. We just need to keep growing. We need to expand. We're constantly looking for the bigger, more, greater, whatever. We've got all this lingo, and all our lexicon is all built around that. But the real, the inner journey, and that, on a micro level, on a macro level, in the ocean, in yourself, the inner journey to me is the richer one at this particular moment. And, to hear Sylvia Earle talk about it, she's like, space is lovely, but it's dead. I mean, the thing I noticed when I was feeling the mass of the ocean around me in the deep, And then you look and, they have really good lights on these you look through the water column and there's just life. It's just everywhere. It is this matrix of life. And so to me, that's just more interesting. On the other hand, if somebody said to me, hey, you can go and see the planet from space, I would be there in a hot minute. But it comes down a little bit to priorities as a society, because the ocean research doesn't get quite enough of everything that it needs. And space seems to get this overabundant amount of excitement and interest. And I guess there's just people like rockets and you can see it. And again, we're also in this whole thing again, where if we can't see it, we're not interested in it. But in the invisible world, there's this great quote, I wish I could remember who said it, but the invisible world can speak to us. And boy, does it ever speak to us if we just pay attention.
Mm.
Oh, Terry Tempest Williams. Terry Tempest Williams did that quote.
Well done.
Yeah.
You were just saying that the cultural thing of not seeing is a hurdle of some sort. Is there more enthusiasm right now with this vessel that goes 11,000 meters deep? Is there, in those circles, is there more support for those ventures now and those goals, or is it getting more difficult to dive deep in that way?
I think what Victor has done with this submersible is literally historical in significance, but it's a perfect example of how this guy's been going all over the world to places nobody's ever gone, deeper and deeper and deeper, taking scientists along with him, taking people like me along with him. And he's gotten some attention, but Elon Musk sends a rocket up, and it's just disproportionately, I don't know why, and maybe you have an idea why, but why it's harder to get people interested in the ocean than it is in space. And this is a very expensive proposition, what he's doing with the submersible. I think the whole system cost, with the ship and everything, cost somewhere along the lines of $60 or $70 million. And he had hoped to sort of basically fund its creation. Like, there were ideas on the drawing board for a submersible like this, but no client who wanted to do it. And whose idea of fun is it to go down into complete pitch darkness into the Mariana Trench? They needed a guy who's or a woman, not only fulfills that notion, but has got the drive to do it and the ability to do it. And so this sort of perfect storm came together in this one individual. He created this submersible, this team, this ship. And then he thought, I'm going to pass this on to somebody else, some science institution, to somebody. And so far, he has not got any takers. I don't know if the virus had something to do with that, but most of the deep sea research at this particular point in time is being done by ROVs, by AUVs, by robots, by gliders. And it makes a lot of sense because they can do more. They can stay in the water 24 hours a day, and you just get more science done. But there's just nothing like the human experience of being down there. That is a different thing. It would be nice if we could have both. I mean, when it comes to exploration of our planet, of the universe, of anything, I don't understand why there isn't more curiosity, I guess, just overall, more drive to explore it. I felt during the pandemic that the real foreclosure of being able to go somewhere and see something you haven't seen before was one of the hardest parts. There's just so much to explore.
Mm. Are there any key learnings that have happened in recent history of going down into the deep, either in peopled vessels or the droney type tech? Is there anything that you've come across that's just really been a huge discovery of sorts?
Yeah, well, there's all kinds of things. And there's so many that I have. It's just files and files and files. And some of them are very small, but they mean big things. Like they're getting close to being able to figure out, in some places, they found a microbe that is, so there's protists, there's like single-celled organisms, and there's eukaryotes, which become us, right? Or trees or animals. There was like this sense of, how did we get from one to the other? They found a microbe that it's called an archaea, but it's got characteristic. They found it in the Arctic in a hydrothermal vent deep under the ocean, and it's got characteristics of eukaryotes, but it's not a eukaryote. So it like there's things like that. Like there's all these pieces to this incredibly intricate puzzle, and we're starting to get these pieces and put them together. And they now know that life goes much, much, much deeper than we thought it would, into the deep beneath the seafloor, deep, like who knows how deep it gets. The threshold that probably determines where it ends is temperature. But there's science now to put a DNA sampler in the water and tell you exactly who's in there. And it doesn't have to be a full genetic sequence. It can be a fragment of DNA. And so there is just this acceleration of learning everything that's going on in the deep right now. And that's why I wanted to write this book right now, even though it's an awfully large topic. I wanted to see how much of that kind of discovery I could get into it. Some of it's quite technical, but if you start delving into it, like it becomes just riveting as well.
Are you one of many doing that? Do you feel like there's a wave of people who are wanting to interpret it? Yeah.
I really hope so. Yeah. I think it's one of the most fascinating subjects in town. So, and like I said, no matter what I do, it's going to be the tip of the iceberg. So I hope a lot of people do. Yeah.
Oh man, so many adventures.
I know. Oh my God.
Will you tell me about your adventure with when you started Surface Visitations that I wrote about in Voices in the Ocean? I wrote about it very briefly, but
yeah. That was a classic moment when I was just loving turning the pages of that book, and then I saw my name there. I was like, oh no. Oh God, here we go. I was just wondering, I don't know. It's been an interesting journey doing citation campaigns and work over the years in the surfing world, and sort of quite easily setting myself up to be a target practice for, the kind of the macho culture of surfing, and but largely it's been quite positive. But anyway, so thank you for speaking sweetly in your book. That whole experience was something that really just came from the network of surfers around the world. So I think that's one of the reasons why we do this Water People podcast and have done so for the last few years is because there is this great saltwater network around the planet of people, coastal people who, dive, surf, sail, and swim. And at that point in time, so this is the early 2000s, I was doing the surfing traveler thing and getting to go back to places around the world each seasonal cycle. And one of those places was Japan. And so going there and learning about the drives, learning about just industrial fishing methods all over the world, and then also realizing that for some strange reason I was very popular in Japan because of my surfing skill and my interests that were more left field than the standard professional surfer. And so it was just this opportunity where I was like, oh wow, okay, so I've got a bit of a platform and access to the surfing public in Japan. And then I found that none of them knew anything about the drives, really. There was small talk of it in just the Wakayama prefecture there, but it was also really uncommon knowledge that cetacean meat was being sold, even with all of the heavy metals and the mercury and everything in the meat, and that the school lunch program was happening, that contaminated meat was being fed to children. And so I felt a real responsibility to share with my surfing kin all that information, and that I had the opportunity to because I had this platform through surf media. And so I started to use that to just share information that for some reason we knew more about those issues here in Australia and New Zealand and whatnot than our friends in Japan who were surfing there. So anyway, that sort of gave me a real kick up the bum to start doing something, anything. And then it was quite interesting. Just 2 days after starting Surface Visitations with my good friend Howie Cook, I had a bottlenose dolphin push a tiger shark away from me in a surfing experience.
That's crazy.
Which was pretty wild after a life of pretty much being in the ocean surfing every day along this stretch of coast. That had never happened to me. And then it was literally quite instant that bottlenose experience happened. And really those type of experiences have continued to happen over the years when I've been working on those issues. Some magical stuff just happens. And so anyway, I then bumped into Rick O'Barry and Louis Sahoyas in Alaska for the International Whaling Commission. And I was there just sort of covering that commission and reporting back to the surfing world on all the misgivings of those meetings. And when we all connected, it was obvious that Rick O'Barry really needed support. He needed people to come there to help elevate his work and help amplify what was going on there. And that was just a no-brainer. It was really quite swift after that. I just put the word out through the surfing world that we were going to go there to do something. And then when we got there, I revealed what it was we wanted to do, which was very peaceful, very ceremonial, very much in line with the Japanese sense of ceremony and tradition there, non-confrontational, very peaceful, and also authentic to the surfing culture that we have this history of doing paddle outs, circles, for those who have passed away as a way to honour them and say goodbye. And so kind of came up with the idea of doing that there. And then that's when, those guys, the whole Ocean Preservation Society film team captured that, and we did all of that.
Yeah, I mean, Taiji, I saw that. I saw, of course, and I know those guys as well. And Rick is one of the characters and voices in the ocean. And Taiji is a hard place, but it's so beautiful. The scenery there, but the town is not.
Yeah.
Hard place.
Yeah.
Do either of you know what the status is of the Taiji tribes?
I think it continues. I mean, I think the toxicity of the meat, I think it has slowed down maybe the fishery of dolphins, but I think the export of dolphins is how they make money. And it's not, it's a off the beaten tourist track. It doesn't have to be, because like I said, I think it's like a UNESCO site and a national park and everything else. Like, it's a spectacular stretch of coastline, but they have just the fishing industry in that little town, or the fishing union or whatever it is, are just hell bent on continuing it. It continues.
Yeah.
I don't know what will stop it. And, the Kuroshio Current comes so close there that they end up with a lot of rarer species coming close enough to the shoreline that they can catch them in these pretty small fishing boats. So when I was there, they had false killer whales, they had pilot whales, they had Rizzo's dolphins, they had some of these just awesome animals, of which there aren't a whole lot. They're just, I don't know how long it goes on. I think Rick is I don't know when he's last been back there. He was kind of ejected from the country, and I think he has gone back once, though. I think he might have gone this year. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so complex, and it's an interesting one for me, just around, I guess, initiatives like that or efforts like that. In the surfing world, it's a very, as you would have experienced through being on Maui and also spending time with some of the surfers in California. It's a small network in some ways, and it's easy to connect with each other and hear each other's stories. But a lot of the time they're quite escapist stories. It's just about, a new wave that's been found to surf, or it's about having a good time. And I was wondering, from all your experience with writing, inserting, and I guess you touched on it before, where you say that you're an activist, but you don't start writing as an activist, laying out good and bad so overtly. But are there any tricks of the trade? Is there anything you could share with us on how to deliver these really emotional or hard to face facts and information, so that we can start having conversations with each other that really need to be happening, especially in areas of coastal communities where the tendency has been to be quite escapist through surfing and the joy of it?
I think you just did it. Like, you speak from the heart, and people have like weird reactions when you start to tell. It doesn't even matter how well-intentioned the person is. I think if somebody starts telling you what to do, something closes up. Whereas if you tell someone a story, and in particular if you tell your story, and you do it in a way that, if you do it, like, hopefully this doesn't sound too sucky, but like, you do it from love, come from a place of the heart. And The Voices in the Ocean was an interesting book to write, because there's a lot of hard stuff going on in Taiji. There's hard stuff going on in the Solomon Islands, where I also went, and yet at the same time there's the magic of the dolphins. So like the balance of them, it's like, here's who they are and here's what we're doing. And those two things, like, a lot of people who care deeply about dolphins were afraid to watch The Cove, because they couldn't bear to see dolphins suffering. It's completely human impulse to not want to immerse yourself in that. So one of the reasons I wrote about Taiji and Voices in the Ocean was for maybe the people that didn't want to look it in the eye the way they even though the movie did a very good job of skirting that a little bit and getting it across at the same time. I try to do the same thing. You tell the truth from the heart, and it's your story. Your story may encompass a lot of other stories that you've brought into your realm, that other people have told you, that scientists have told me, or that I've learned. But it's my story, and everybody reacts to people want to hear other people. And so the most important thing is to speak in your own voice. And, as a writer, that's job one, is to find out, how are you going to tell the story in a unique way that's your voice? It's not another voice you've heard. It's like, what are you bringing to this party? What you bring to this party is your heart, your voice. So we often think, hey, this is the way it's done. Look at this as the formula for this or that. To me, I say, no. You could technically get in there and make sure that everything that takes away from the perfect telling of your story is removed in the editing process, or in the, how you choose to structure it process. But the ultimate thing that has to come through is the resonance of you. And you just did that when you just told your story. So you don't need any tricks of the trade.
I could do with a bit of scrubbing up. Well, it's thank you for sharing. It feels like a really important skill at this point in time, when there's so many sort of, I guess, spot fires popping up everywhere that need to be put out, and we need to be just speaking with each other and having actual conversations of back and forth.
Yeah, that's why we've come back to the podcast over the last few seasons. It's just feeling deeply the power of storytelling to connect us, to create the opportunity for real dialogue, to break down barriers when it's so easy to get into that place of telling instead of showing, and spewing facts instead of...
There's a big rule there. Yep.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, and for doing such
beautiful
storytelling, and taking us along with you, and managing to be a potent activist through all of your books. It's really inspiring.
Yeah, I'm a stealth activist. Journalist by day, stealth activist by night.
Yeah. Thanks to Susan for her expert storytelling and for being such a stellar advocate for the magic of the ocean. Special thanks always to our sound engineer and in-house musician, Shannon Sol Carroll. On behalf of myself, Lauren Hill, and my partner in rhyme, Dave Rastovich, thanks for making the time to listen with us. If you have a spare moment, please consider leaving a review of the podcast or sharing an episode with a friend. Both help us to keep the podcast going and to find the very best stories from our global community of water people. We'll be continuing today's conversation on Instagram, where we're at Water People Podcast. You can find every episode on our website, waterpeoplepodcast.com.